Welcome to Philosophy for Theologians, your favorite infrequent discussion of philosophy from a reformed theological perspective. I'm your host again, James Baird, and joining me also again is Jonathan Brack, Director of Admissions and PhD candidate at Westminster Theological Seminary. It's good to have you on again, Jonathan.
Excited to be here once again.
This is the last episode in a series on the thought of philosopher Jacques Derrida. Our guest, our distinguished guest, is Dr. Christopher Watkin, Senior Lecturer in French Studies at Monash University. Dr. Watkin received his MPhil and PhD from Cambridge. He's also a Reformed Christian and presently writing the Derrida installment of the Great Thinkers series published by P&R Publishing. Welcome to the program, Chris. It's glad to have you again.
Hi, James. Hello, Jonathan. It's lovely to speak with you again.
Well, in this last episode, we're going to wrap up our discussion of Derrida by looking at his theology. Given the material that we've been through in the previous two episodes, it might be a surprise to some listeners to hear that there's much to say on Derrida and theology at all. Did he write a lot in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. You can sort of see almost all of his writing as engaging with theological themes on some level or another. So in the first session I was talking about this early book, this really important foundational book of his, of grammatology. And in that book, just for one example, he considers the Western understanding of meaning and truth to be irreducibly theological. And he critiques it on that basis. But he's also written some books that more squarely fit in what we would call a theological bookshelf. So we've already talked about the gift of death, where he discusses Kierkegaard's reading of Genesis 22. He's tackled the notion of faith and knowledge straight on in a little text called Faith and Knowledge, where he discusses Kant. And just one last example, that there would be others, but just to give you a sense of the breadth of his writing in this area, there's a very intimate, very personal, very touching text called Circumfession, which he wrote in the first person on his own life, sort of interweaving reflections on Augustine's Confessions as he recounts his own story as well. So there's a whole lot of material out there by Derrida that touches really quite frontally on theological themes.
So we've discussed a couple of myths to start us out, such as he's just a straight relativist, or Derrida just can be summed up as you can never say what you mean or mean what you say. What's the myth for this episode?
Yeah, thank you. I think that sometimes people think that Derrida says that you've just got to invent your own God, or something like, God can be whatever you want him to be, or you just become your own God. And again, I think that's not only wrong, but it's really unhelpful for understanding what he does say, because it's almost the exact opposite of how he tries to talk about these themes.
So, Chris, where would you like to jump in to what Derrida has to say about theology?
Okay, well, let's start off with a question, a pretty straightforward question. Is Derrida an atheist? The answer is sort of. Let's begin by talking about a God he definitely does not believe in. And it's called the God of ontotheology. It's a term that Martin Heidegger came up with to describe the sort of God that Aristotle has. It's ontos, meaning being, theos, meaning God, and logos here, meaning study. So ontotheology is the study of God as the highest being. And this is really, really useful and important for Aristotle, and he calls this God the unmoved mover, because it's the bedrock on which Aristotle's whole universe stands. And Heidegger tries to tease this out a bit in a series of seminars that he gave called Identity and Difference, where he talks about Aristotle's God as causa sui, the cause of itself, the self-caused thing. And this is how Heidegger describes Aristotle's God, as quote, "This is the appropriate name, causa sui, for the God of philosophy. Man cannot pray to this God or offer sacrifices to him. Man cannot fall to his knees in awe before the causa sui, nor dance and play music before this God. So in other words, this is a concept God. It's a God that does a job for Aristotle and is necessary for a particular way of looking and understanding the world. But it's not really much more than that. This God provides coherence for Aristotle's universe, because everything has a cause. And the uncaused cause, if you like, is the first domino that sets all the other dominoes falling as a first cause. It gives Aristotle's universe unity, because all causes can be traced back to this one uncaused cause. And it makes Aristotle's universe well-founded as well, because it's the metaphysical ground and foundation of all being. So it does a philosophical job for Aristotle. But as far as Derrida is concerned, it's slap bang in the center of the metaphysics of presence that I talked about in the first of these episodes. It's probably useful to point out that ontotheology, the God of ontotheology, isn't the only instance of the metaphysics of presence for Derrida, and he puts it alongside other ideas that are all equally logocentric. So, for example, in one of his really famous early essays, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, that many undergraduate courses on Derrida set, he says this. He talks about the metaphysics of presence as, quote, essence, existence, substance, subject, transcendentality, consciousness, God, man, and so forth. So you can see God is just one of these instances in the metaphysics of presence for Derrida. But this God of ontotheology is very much something that Derrida wants to deconstruct. And here we're going back to all the material about différance that we covered in the first of these sessions, and that I don't want to go over again. So he does not believe in the God of ontotheology, but the question remains, is he an atheist? There are many people who don't believe in the God of ontotheology and are still not atheists. Well, Derrida's a little bit coy. In Circumfession, he has this quotation. He talks about the constancy of God in my life is called by other names, so that I quite rightly pass for an atheist, close quote. Now, at this point, we might sort of roll our eyes at Derrida and say, come on, come out with it. Are you an atheist or not? Let's just have done with it. But the reason that he doesn't want to just say, I am an atheist, is for a very good reason, that would be just as ontotheological as saying I'm a theist. It'd be just as absolute a claim to make about the nature of the universe. It would be just as hubristic a claim to be, I'm in possession of all the facts such that I can authoritatively declare that there absolutely is no God. And it would be just as much of a claim to know ultimate truth with certainty. It's just as dogmatic, quite frankly. There's no difference between a dogmatic theism then and a dogmatic atheism. And so for Derrida to say, I am an atheist, would commit the same error as we saw in the previous episode, where if you were to say, I know that right here and now, I am just. The decision that I'm making is definitely just. So as far as Derrida is concerned, we simply can't have enough information to make that claim. Which then raises the question, okay, well, is he an agnostic then? Not quite, because he does say in an interview in Positions that différance, quote, blocks every relationship to theology. And so in other words, you can't both have an irreconcilable differing and deferring at the origin of identity. You can't have Derrida's différance and also the traditional God of Western theology. They don't mix. So it doesn't quite do justice to his position to say he's an agnostic, because that would leave open more of a possibility for a traditional understanding of God than he's willing to admit. What I want to go on to as the main discussion today, off the back of that question of how does he position himself in relation to atheism and theism, is to take one of a series of motifs that he has that all follow the same structure. And the structure is X without X. So he'll talk, for example, in some places of religion without religion. And he'll talk about God without God. And the reason that he uses that sort of language is that he wants to get rid of determinate content in these ideas. For the same reason that we saw last time, he wants to get rid of being enslaved to procedural codified law. That if something is determinate, set down there in black and white, then it's limiting and it shuts oneself down to being surprised by the other. And so the motif that I want to look at today that does that is what he calls messianicity without messianism. I just want to unpack that a little bit because it'll help us to understand these other X without X constructions that he uses as well.
Sure.
So he starts off by looking at different messianisms that have occurred in Western culture. And there are two main branches. There's the religious and the secular. So for religious messianism, he looks at the Jewish idea for the hope of a future appearing of God's anointed, who's going to bring justice and peace on earth, who's going to vindicate God's people and restore their fortunes. And so for this Jewish sort of messianism, the present is lived in the expectation, looking forward to a future glorious moment when the messianic prophecy is going to be fulfilled. And then he turns away from Judaism and he looks at Marxism. And he says that there's something very similar going on in Marxism. Because what Marx looks forward to in the future is the inevitable proletarian revolution that's going to bring about, after a period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, a classless society of justice and of peace. And just as in the case of Jewish messianism, the present for the Marxist is lived in confident expectation of this inevitable future overturning of fortunes. So he takes those determinate messianisms with particular content, because the Jew knows that it is going to be Messiah who comes, and the Jew knows that the Messiah is going to vindicate God's people, and the Marxist knows that it's going to be a proletarian revolution, that it's going to overthrow the capitalist system. So there's some determinate content to these messianisms. And what he does is he offers instead not one more determinate messianism, but what he calls this messianicity without messianism. And he describes it in this way. He talks about a messianism which I regard as a universal structure of experience and which cannot be reduced to a religious messianism of any stripe, close quote. So what he's seeking to do is to maintain this attitude and expectation of something that's coming in the future, messianicity, but without giving that thing that's coming a label, without making it a determinate agent who's going to do X, Y, and Z. And that's his without messianism. And therefore he holds on to this structure of a promise, a structure of something to come. But what is to come, for Derrida, is, quote, the most irreducibly heterogeneous otherness, close quote. So in other words, whatever it is that's coming, we certainly don't know what it is. We can't predict it. We are not expecting it. And that's what this radically heterogeneous otherness is going to bring about for Derrida, is what he calls the democracy to come. It's really important to understand. He doesn't just mean a little tweaking and tightening up of democracy as we have it now. It's going to be a complete rupture with current political systems. It's going to be unexpected, like the justice in the force of law. We can't predict it in advance. So he says in his one of his later books called Rogues, for example, quote, the event must also announce itself without calling in advance, without forewarning, announcing itself without announcing itself, without any horizon of expectation, any telos, formation, form, or teleological preformation. Whence he says it's monstrous, unrepresentable character. And what he means by being monstrous is that it's going to surprise us, it's going to shock us, it's going to blow our categories when it comes. We won't be expecting it. And of course, this idea of the monstrous parallels his idea of the immediate absolute call of God to Abraham that we looked at in the last episode. It asserts itself immediately, abruptly, radically, in a way that I can't assimilate, in a way that I can't make sense of in terms of my usual categories for understanding the world. And so therefore, if we try to sum up, what is Derrida trying to get at with this messianicity without messianism and this democracy to come? What is he trying to keep hold of? What he's trying to secure is radical unpredictability. At the moment we can say, I know what's coming, I know what the solution is, politically, theologically, is for Derrida the moment that we've stepped too far. He talks in one interview about a future that would not be monstrous, he says, would not be a future. It would already be predictable, calculable, and programmable from tomorrow. So what he's seeking to avoid is that tomorrow is basically just like today, only a little bit different. In the same way that in the Abraham passage, what he wants to avoid is the idea that the other is basically just like me, perhaps a little bit different, but basically like me. And one further feature of this democracy to come that's important to get a handle on in understanding the way that Derrida reframes messianism is that it never actually does come fully. And this again is like never being able to say, I know that I'm just right here and now. So in a book called The Politics of Friendship, he says this. He says, democracy remains to come. This is its essence insofar as it remains. Not only will it remain indefinitely perfectible, hence always insufficient, always future, but belonging to the time of the promise, it will always remain in each of its future times to come. So by characterizing his thought as a messianicity without messianism, he's not suggesting that one day everything is going to slot into place, we're going to have perfect equality, we're going to have perfect freedom, everything's going to be fine. That there's an irreducibly promissory aspect to this. We're working hard, we're seeking to approximate, but we're never going to get there fully and finally. So then, what is the take-home message about all of this? How to pull together what I've been talking about so far? I think, theologically speaking, his primary concern, what he's desperate to ensure, is that we don't restrict the future coming, the future otherness, the future messianism, by knowing what it'll be before it comes, by expecting that it's going to conform to our current expectations. And so his messianicity is about a radical openness to the other, to what I'm not expecting. Just like Abraham's openness to the command of God that completely blew his categories on Mount Moriah. And this is why it is absolutely 180 degrees wrong to say that Derrida says we each invent our own God, or God is whatever we want him to be. It'd be closer to Derrida to say something like, whatever you want God to be, that is exactly what he will not be. Because the otherness to come will definitely confound your expectations, will definitely blow your categories. So whatever you want it to be and whatever you think it is, you can be sure that it won't be that.
I'm fascinated. Does he usually speak about sort of this promise and hope, sort of momentum that remains? Does he speak about it in positive categories, or does he ever set aside some room for it could be doom? That, but maybe that he would say that would be in itself to go too far. You can't say that. That's wholly other is neither good nor bad. Or
Jonathan, you have just hit the jackpot. That is a debate that rages among Derrida scholars. So, for example, someone like Martin Hageland in his book Radical Atheism takes Derrida to task for just that reason. He says, look, if the other is radically other, then might it not exactly as you've just said be an evil that comes? Surely if there's no prescription on what it might be, if it's a radical openness, then might it not be that it's a disaster that comes? Now, there is a response to that from within Derrida's way of looking at things. It's a slightly awkward response, but it is still a response. And it's to say that the democracy to come, and this is the way that he talks about it, will be an impossible uniting of absolute equality with absolute freedom. Now, none of us knows what that's going to look like, because it would seem that equality and freedom are in tension with each other. But when he does talk about the democracy to come, he puts it in terms of a perfect unity of absolute equality and absolute freedom. Now, that, of course, raises the question, whoa, wait a minute. So if that is what is coming, it's not radically other, perhaps. It cannot be evil. We do know something about it altogether, and that's where you get into lots of detailed debates back and forth. But that's a bit of a thumbnail sketch of why you're completely on the money with what you just said.
Right. Okay. So based on that, as far as almost, it sounds almost like an eschatology of Derrida, but yet wholly other. How would you, biblically, how would we interface with this from a biblical point of view?
Yeah, thank you. I think the place to start again is with this idea of diagonalization, that the Bible sets things up in a way that doesn't fit snugly in Derrida's categories, either in terms of what he rejects or what he accepts. It cuts across the way that he sets things up. Because what he gives us is a choice between the God of ontotheology and a radical otherness that we can't predict. And really the God of the Bible is neither of those things. So let's see how the Bible sets things up, and then let's try and do some comparison between the Bible and Derrida. We're back to this really foundational idea of absolute personality that I touched on briefly in the ethics episode in relation to the Ten Commandments. Let's come at it this time through John's prologue again. So we've got the word, logos, which, as John's prologue progresses, is revealed not to be an it, but to be a he. Mm-hmm. So in verse 1 of John's prologue, this logos is very clearly on the creator side of the creator-creature distinction. But by verse 17, we see that he has got a name, Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And so by the time we get to verse 17, we see that the absolute creator, the word, is a person. Notice, and this is really, really key, not just is personal or can be thought of in terms of personhood, where personal and personhood are sort of abstract concepts, but is a specific person, Jesus Christ. So then God is absolute, and God is personal in that he is a triune person, and you know that we can name Jesus. Mm-hmm. And this is getting back to this equal ultimacy again. It's not that God is really absolute and then he sort of becomes personal a little bit later on. And it's not that basically he's personal and then he sort of works his way up to being absolute. No, absoluteness and personality are equally ultimate in God. And just let me hammer this a little bit more, because I think for Reformed Christians trying to get to grips with Derrida, but also with secular thought more broadly, it's really, really important. This absolute personality is foundational for the way in which the Bible thinks about God, at least as I understand it. And that means that things like logic are reliant on God, not determinate of him. Let me just give you a quote from Van Til's Defense of the Faith. He says, "There were no principles of truth, goodness, or beauty that were next to or above God, according to which he patterned the world. The principles of truth, goodness, and beauty are to be thought of as identical with God's being. They're the attributes of God." So in other words, the universe as described in the Bible has nothing more original, nothing more simple, and nothing more fundamental than God in his irreducible Trinitarianism and God's character. So he's not the product of logic, but the law of non-contradiction itself, and this is Van Til again, is, quote, "the expression on a created level of the internal coherence of God's nature." Just like in the previous episode on ethics, we saw that the Ten Commandments are. And where this gets crucial for trying to work out how the Bible relates to what Derrida is saying is that being, as well as an abstract concept, is not originary in relation to God. Van Til says again in the Introduction to Systematic Theology, there was no universal being of which God was a particular instance. So God, the God of the Bible, is not subordinate to or less fundamental than being. He's not one example of the thing called being which is greater than him and exceeds him, any more than he's subordinate to or less fundamental than logic. And so everything that exists, biblically looked at in creation, continues to exist and began to exist because God wills it, including order and logic. And his own existence isn't just one instance of a fundamental abstract reality, whether we call that being or whatever else we call it, but God himself in his absolute personality is original and fundamental. And that sets things up really, really differently to ontotheology. Because ontotheology describes an impersonal, uncaused cause that sets the universe in motion. You can describe it as pure thought or thought thinking itself, or something like that, which is a million miles away from the God of the Bible. But also, the absolute personality of the Bible doesn't really fit within Derrida's absolute openness to the otherness to come either. What it does, if you put ontotheology, Derrida's absolute openness, and absolute personality, theism, all on the table at once, what you find is that the position that Derrida rejects and his own position actually end up like looking like subtle variations on the same theme when you compare it with biblical absolute personality theism, rather than looking like the chalk and cheese that people who write on Derrida often talk of them about, as if there could be nothing more different than ontotheology and Derrida's absolute openness. Well, look at them in relation to absolute personality theism. They've got a lot in common compared to that. And so, therefore, absolute personality theism is again diagonalizing Derrida's options. It's not the God of ontotheology, and it is not the absolute, immediate, undetermined demand that can't be given any content. Of course, the Bible does say that God's thoughts are not our thoughts, nor his words our words, absolutely. But God has revealed himself to us in language for which he takes responsibility. And just to sneak in another little footnote here, I don't think we can really get our heads around this unless we just do a little bit of work on the doctrine of accommodation and a biblical view of the relation between God and language. Accommodation, a word that Calvin uses in the Institutes to talk about the way in which God reveals himself to us. The wonderful thing about God accommodating himself to human language in order to reveal himself, and this is great news for all Christians, is that it makes language God's problem, not a human problem. So for Derrida, to capture God in human language would be like the flesh becoming word. You know, it'd be like us reaching up and capturing heaven and presenting it in a jam jar. It'd be a huge act of hubris and self-importance to claim that we could ever do something like that. But that's not what the Bible claims, of course. The Bible claims that God has accommodated himself to our understanding. Not the flesh became word, but the word became flesh, which is a very different proposition altogether. And so absolute personality theism is diagonalizing Derrida's two options here, because it's showing that both the position that Derrida rejects and his own position have in common that they're bottom-up solutions, if you like, to talking about absolute otherness or to talking about God. Either you've got the idea that you can capture God in human categories, which Derrida quite rightly rejects, or you've got his own position that woe betide anyone who seeks to do that, and we should be open to absolute otherness. They're both assuming that the only way that we can go about this is in a bottom-up sort of way. We either capture God or we don't capture God. But what accommodation does is it says, no, the thing that you share, you two positions, the one that Derrida is for and the one that he's against, is actually contested in the Bible. And I think that B.B. Warfield, in his Inspiration and Authority of the Bible, puts this quite densely but really, really crisply. And so I'll just read a short quotation. He says, "There is no ground for imagining that God is unable to frame his own message in the language of the organs of his revelation, without it thereby ceasing to be, because expressed in a fashion natural to those organs, therefore purely his message." Or, to put it in slightly less elegant language, if relating language to God is our problem, we're stuffed. But if relating language to God is God's problem, of course he can speak about himself truly in language that we can understand, because he's God, after all. And
Right.
Indeed, it would be arrogant to claim that God is incapable of expressing himself in a way that is true to himself and yet that we can understand. So it shifts the humility from saying, oh no, I couldn't possibly say anything about God that will capture him, to God has said something about himself, and it would be arrogant to assume that he's incapable of doing so. And so when we get, therefore, with that under our belts, to messianicity without messianism, it would seem, on first blush, that we've got a real problem here, that we've got a real disjunction between what Derrida is saying and what the Bible's saying. Because if you remember, messianicity without messianism for Derrida is all about this radical openness to the future. We can't predict it, we can't script it, we've got to be willing to be surprised by what's coming. But then you turn to the pages of the Bible and you read in Ephesians 1, for example, that God predestined people for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ according to the purpose of his will. And you think, my goodness, nothing could seem further than this radically open and monstrous future than the biblical picture of a God who predestines before the foundation of the world, no less, in Ephesians 1 verse 5, those who will be saved.
Yes.
Now, I don't think it's quite as easy as that. And I think, once again, just to use this term one last time, that the Bible doesn't sit in opposition to Derrida here, but it actually diagonalizes the options that he gives us, which are either a radical openness to a monstrous future or a pre-programmed predictability. I don't think the Bible goes with either of those, lock, stock, and barrel. And actually, I think you can go a little bit further than that. And you can say that from a biblical point of view, Derrida's own openness is just as closed as the predictability that he condemns. And it's only biblical predestination that gives us a true openness. So let me just try and tease those out. First of all, in what sense, from a biblical point of view, is Derrida just as closed as the predictability that he condemns? It's quite an incendiary charge, so I need to back it up. Ask the question, is Derrida's openness itself open to being surprised? In the sense that, could it be anything other than something which will be surprising to us, which comes? And the answer is no. In one of his early works on the problem of Genesis in Husserl's philosophy, he's quite clear about the sort of thing that he does in deconstruction. And he says this, quote, "It is always," note that word, "a question of an originary complication of the origin, of an initial contamination of the simple, of an inaugural divergence that has no analysis could present, make present in its phenomenon, or reduced to the point-like nature of an element, instantaneous, identical to itself." And so, in the same way, Derrida's messianicity without messianism will always insist, without fail, upon the structural rather than the determinate. It's always openness rather than closure. And this is a critique that's been made, among others, by Derrida's one-time collaborator and contemporary French philosopher Catherine Malabou, who contrasts deconstruction with her own idea that she calls plasticity. And she says Derrida's deconstruction is a bit like a tick or a twitch. It always does the same thing. Whatever it comes across, it deconstructs it. Now, that's pretty full on for a Derridian, who would say you've misunderstood what Derrida is doing. He always uses different terms. He draws deconstruction out of the text. But I don't want to get into that debate now. I just want to put on the table that critique of him is out there, that deconstruction is predictable precisely because it always deconstructs. It is always for openness, always against determinate content. And therefore, that its openness itself is closed as openness. It is not itself open. It knows that the to come will be monstrous, and it jolly well won't be predictable.
It has no other option but to be open.
Yeah, you could put it that way. Absolutely. But then we haven't discussed biblical predestination. Surely that is closed by any definition, wouldn't you think? Well, not quite, because in the biblical account, it's the contours of God's character that shape what is to come, but not in a way that is particularly closed. Let me try and deal with it a piece at a time. So there is absolutely, and this is a difference between Derrida and the Bible. When the Bible looks to the future, there is some determinate content to it. We know something about what will happen when Christ returns. We know, for example, that those who know God will see God face to face. We know that there'll be no more mourning or crying or pain. And we know that there won't be in the New Jerusalem weeping and gnashing of teeth. So there's some content to the messianic expectation that's given. But nevertheless, and equally importantly with that, we try to discern in vain exactly how God's character is going to shine forth on the new heavens and the new earth, exactly what it's going to feel like or what it's going to be to live in that reality. It's as futile as a two-dimensional shape trying to imagine itself in three dimensions. We just haven't got the faculties to paint a picture of heaven or to imagine it adequately. And in that sense, there is, from our point of view, an openness.
Mm-hmm. Could we describe that possibly by saying that there's an openness epistemologically for us, although it's closed metaphysically in terms that it's already been exhaustively determined by God's decree?
I think you would probably want to be careful about hammering that too much. It is certainly the case that epistemologically we are ill-equipped to imagine what the new heavens and the new earth will be like. And it is certainly the case that God is preparing a place there for those who will join him. So from his point of view, it's not a secret. So I think providing you don't push too far with that, and I think the hesitation that I'm trying to work through in this is that it would be possible to hold either of those truths in a way that made the other objectionable. So we shouldn't hold our epistemological openness such that it pulls the rug out from under God's sovereign plan. And we shouldn't hold God's sovereign plan to the extent that it makes it impossible to hold our epistemological openness anymore. With that little caveat, I think that's a good description. But it leaves the question for us of, okay, so Derrida is really worried about any future that is planned out or scripted in advance. Because we can't be surprised by otherness. We can't be open to anything apart from what we expect. And so the question is fired back to the biblical idea of the future. Well, surely that's what you're presenting, isn't it? It's a scripted, planned out future. I think yes and no. There is absolutely a sense that from God's perspective, that Christ was the Lamb crucified and foreknown before the foundation of the world. 1 Peter 1. But seen from a human view, and again, that it's important to hold this in a way that predestination doesn't squash. From a human view, just think about the cross. The cross was hardly calculable or in linear continuity with people's expectations of a Messiah. The Jewish people at the time were expecting a lot of things in relation to what the Messiah would be, but crucified was not high on their list of what they thought he was going to be like. In fact, only a small number of people believed in the crucified Savior. Most people ridiculed the idea, whether Roman or Jewish. And in fact, Christ ended up being put to death, partly because of his view of the sort of Messiah he was. So in that sense, you could say, my goodness, in the history of the world, there's hardly been anything more monstrous, in Derrida's sense, more outside the categories of what people were expecting, than a God who would become a human being to die on a cross. If that doesn't blow people's religious categories, there's nothing that will. And indeed, you can see that today, can't you? The cross is still monstrous for many people in the world today. It's the sort of thing that any God that I would believe in could never do. For many people today, it is the stumbling block to Christianity. I can believe in God, but a God who would die for the sins of the world on a cross, no. That I'm not willing to go that far. And so in that sense, the cross is still monstrous. It is still unassimilable to people's categories of expectation today. which pushes us on to the next question. Okay, well, fine, but does predestination, though, rob humanity of creativity? Surely, if God has the future predestined, then there can't be anything but a predictable outworking of a script that's been written in advance, which is exactly the sort of thing that Derrida is desperate to avoid by his radical openness. But I think a reformed view actually turns the tables on Derrida at this point, and argues that far from trapping humanity in a predictable outworking of a scripted plot, God's predestination is actually the precondition of human creativity. Because the alternative to predestination and the sovereignty of God is the sovereignty of chance, both inside my brain, in terms of the neurons that fire together, and outside my brain in the world. And it's chance, sovereignly, that thwarts all human creative aspirations. This is the point that Van Til's making in Christian Theistic Ethics. I'll just throw in a little quote from him, so I think it's really helpful in crystallizing this. He says, as Christians, we hold that determinate human experience could work to no end, could work in accordance with no plan, and could not even get underway if it were not for the existence of the absolute will of God. It is on this ground, then, that we hold to the absolute will of God as the presupposition of the will of man. And he carries on, looked at in this way, that which to many seems at first glance to be the greatest hindrance to moral responsibility, namely the conception of an absolutely sovereign God, becomes the very foundation of its possibility. Close quote. So then, to try and drag that together and summarize it, the Bible diagonalizes Derrida's options of, one, a future which is scripted and predictable and more of the same, and two, a radically open future which can admit of no determinate content. And the way that it diagonalizes this is by introducing to us a sovereign God whose character shapes the future and whose sovereignty is actually the ground of his people's responsibility and creativity, rather than making that impossible.
Fascinating. Excellent. Absolutely. That's great. I love how a close reading of Derrida, we would agree with him in the rejection of an onto-theology because it's not the theology of the Bible, and what's more is that the theology of the Bible actually, as you were saying, diagonalizes the true concern that Derrida has as far as what onto-theology gives you, and openness, his category, openness and a democracy to come. So that's incredible. I love that.
Well, Chris, now stepping back for a second, reflecting now on this whole series, I'm wondering if you could summarize for us a biblical response to Derrida's thought as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a real journey for me writing this book for P&R, trying to come to grips with Derrida and do him justice as well as I can, but also to do a biblical view of the world justice as well. And I think the thing that's really come out to me again and again is that the biblical view of God takes Derrida's categories by surprise. It offers a reality of God that's neither the self-identical presence that deconstruction is seeking to show to be illusory, nor is it Derrida's alternative of différance, to take those terms from the first of these podcasts. And so what the Bible is doing, I think, is it's showing that both the positions that Derrida rejects and those that he espouses actually share quite a lot in common. And as I said previously, they can sort of be seen as subtle variations on a theme compared to a biblical view, which cuts across both of them. I think it's also been reinforced for me, trying to look at Derrida and the Bible side by side, that if you begin with the assumptions of deconstruction, différance and so on, you cannot end up with biblical Christianity, however hard you try. And if you begin with the assumptions of biblical Christianity, the creator-creature distinction, absolute personality theism, equal ultimacy of unity and diversity, and other stuff that I talk about in the book that we haven't had a chance to do in these podcasts, you cannot end up with deconstruction as Derrida sees it. Now, this by no means leads to the conclusion, I really want to be clear on this, by no means leads to the conclusion that we've got nothing to learn from Derrida or from deconstruction, and I hope I've shown that as we've gone through, and there's a lot more to learn that we haven't had a chance to mention. But what it does show us is that biblical Christianity, I think, sits athwart both deconstruction and the positions that it critiques, in the same way, actually, that deconstruction sits athwart the logic of presence and identity, neither straightforwardly affirming it, nor simply rejecting it. And so to try and sum the whole thing up in one sentence, I think this would be my shot at it. It would be that deconstruction does not see biblical Christianity coming.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for these 3 thrilling and exciting episodes. I'm sure that our readers will both enjoy these episodes and have learned a lot.
It's been a real privilege for me. And James and Jonathan, thank you so much for your patience while I rabbited on, your really excellent questions, and for setting this whole thing up. I'm really thankful to you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, we are looking forward to having you on Philosophy for Theologians in the future.
I look forward to that too.